Hey guys, thank you for tuning in to another episode of InRange. I'm going to pose an interesting argument to you today that I want you to have an open mind about. The idea that the world's first truly military-applied assault rifle was not the STG-44, or the Sturmgewehr, or storm rifle as coined by Hitler in 1944. I'm going to go ahead and pose the argument that the idea of the assault rifle, at least in role and application, goes all the way back to the 1860 Henry. So bear with me for a moment. Let's consider what the rationale is behind the assault rifle. The idea being it's an intermediate cartridge that fires from a high-capacity feeding device that has select fire. And the idea behind this being is that you don't need the power and range that a full rifle cartridge provides to you. You don't need to hit at 1,000 meters. The reality is most combat occurs from 400 meters in, 300 meters in fact, 50 meters in. There's reports from the Eastern Front of World War II in which the Germans reported back saying that they almost never saw engagements past 400 meters and that most were within 50 meters. So if you take that in mind, you don't need a full-size battle rifle to be able to engage in general standard combat distances. And in fact, the ability of having a large capacity feeding device with an intermediate cartridge and less recoil means that you can do something you can't do with a normal rifle, and that you can suppress and do all sorts of dynamic movement that you couldn't do with a standard full-size cartridge. Well, that concept actually goes back to 1860 as I was describing with the Henry. The idea is the 44 Henry Rimfire. If you were to look at it by modern standards, you would consider it a pistol round, and indeed, it really is. It's a 200 grain bullet at 1,100 feet per second. But if you compare it to the other cartridges and rifles of the time, it was an intermediate cartridge. Let me explain. The traditional rifle then was a muzzleloader firing a 500 grain Minet ball at generally around 800 to 900 to 1,000 feet per second. Single shot, slow to load, stuffed from the front. Okay? Then we started moving into trapdoor and experimental trapdoor rifles. All sorts of different Allen conversions, etc. These are also full-size power cartridges. Well, these cartridges can reach out to 1,000 meters. They can go a long distance. It's a 450 grain or 500 grain bullet moving at reasonably fast velocities. That's a lot of foot-pounds of energy. However, even with a trapdoor rifle, it's a single-shot affair. Load the cartridge, close it, engage, aim, fire, open, extract, insert a new one, close it, cock the hammer, fire, engage. If you can keep your targets at that 600, 700, 800 meter distance, you can continue to engage them. But what if the targets get closer? What if things get within 100 meters, 50 meters? U.S. Civil War, Battle of Allatoona Pass, Georgia, October 5th, 1864. The 7th Illinois Regiment had 191 Henry rifles and fired over 31,000 rounds of ammunition out of them in that battle alone. According to Major William Ludlow in his account of the battle, what saved us that day was the fact that we had a number of Henry rifles. Those were new guns in those days, and the commander held in reserve a company of an Illinois regiment that was armed with them until the final assault should be made. When the artillery reopened, this company of only 16 shooters sprang to the parapet and poured out such a multiplied, rapid, deadly fire that no man could stand in front of it. In fact, both the Union and Confederate soldiers in their memoirs of that day stated that the 16-shooter, which by the way was a loving term for the Henry and that it held 16 rounds, the 16-shooter rifles were all that saved the day for the Union in that terrible October battle. U.S. Indian Wars, Wagon Box Fight, August 2nd, 1867. 26 U.S. soldiers and 6 private contractors are attacked by a force of nearly 1,000 Sioux and Cheyenne Indians. They actually used the wagon boxes that they were transporting goods as a defensible position, overturn them, get in them, poke holes in them, and use them as firing ports. What the Indians did not know was that these U.S. soldiers and 6 contractors were armed with trapdoor Springfield rifles, early ones of the time, as well as a few Henry rifles. They were able to hold off 1,000 enemies. 32 men with repeating rifles held off an opposing force of 1,000. They lost somewhere between 6 to 7 on the American side, and the Indians and U.S. reports concur that somewhere between 300 to 800 of the Indians were killed in this battle. In fact, The Indians were amazed at the rapidity and continuousness of our fire. They did not know that we had been equipped with breech loaders and supposed that after firing our first shot they could ride us down before we could reload. U.S. Indian Wars, Battle of the Little Bighorn, June 1876. So in spite of numerous battle accounts, not only in the Civil War but in the early Indian Wars, of the Henry having an incredible capacity on the battlefield in terms of its fire supremacy and ability to suppress the enemy, of course the U.S. military decides that they're going to standardize on a full-size cartridge. They go with the trapdoor rifle and carbine, chambered in .45-70 and .45-55 respectively. The 55 being a little bit less powder charge for the carbine to keep the recoil down. Now, these rifles can engage out to 1,000 yards, 1,000 meters, but the reality is the actual marksmanship of the soldiers using them generally cannot do that. So they have a lot of power and a lot of recoil and a slow rate of fire to reach out at long distances that, for the most part, can't be leveraged properly. However, the Americans are under the concept that they want to keep the enemy at distance and at bay, and they'll engage them with these rifles that have full power. The Indians actually prefer close combat. Kind of always have. In fact, they had things called like counting coup, where it was a proof of merit where you'd run up and touch an enemy and run away without actually hurting them. Scary stuff, but it was something that they put a lot of weight in. And so they actually really loved the 1860 Henry, and as well as the 1866 Winchester, which is essentially an improved Henry. And the Battle of Little Bighorn, they learned to navigate the terrain properly. It was their land. They knew what they were dealing with. Custer and his men stumbled into a huge village of Plains Indians, of which, of course, we know the outcome of that. The Indians would use the terrain, navigate within their 200 to 100 yards, come up with their Henry rifles, and unleash withering fire. Men at that point with their single-shot rifles had almost no chance to be able to defend themselves. They might switch to a pistol if they had one, but of course a pistol against a rifle, guess what wins? The rifle. In the 1980s, there was a fire that moved through the Bighorn site, and there was an archaeological dig in which they uncovered hundreds and hundreds, if not thousands, of cases on the battlefield. And they were able to track how many Henry rifles were there, at least a subset of Henry rifles, by looking at the actual brass. Now, a Henry rifle, because it was a rimfire, had two firing pins, one on each side. The idea being that it was more assured ignition of the cartridge on a rimfire. So when you find a 44 rimfire Henry case in the ground, if it's got a double strike with a firing pin, that was fired from a Henry or 1866 Winchester. And they found tons of these cases at the Bighorn site. And in fact, they were able to do forensic analysis of it and determine how many unique Henry rifles were firing there. And of all the individual unique rifles that they've been able to identify to the Indian forces, half, if not over half of them, were Henrys or 1866 Winchesters. This proves that the Indians had an incredible fire superiority capability with their capacity once they got within range. So, you know, what's interesting about this is that, so we see the Civil War, and then we see the Indian Wars, and then we see Little Bighorn, and we see this recurring theme where this pistol cartridge, or intermediate cartridge of the time, performs incredibly well on the battlefield. Yet it took until the 1960s for the Americans to standardize on an intermediate cartridge, the 5.56. I can't explain that. Well, I know that the word assault rifle has baggage, but if you think about it in its applied role, the 1860 Henry, in my opinion, was the first assault rifle. Hope you learned something today. If you like this kind of content, please consider supporting us on Patreon. It's honestly what allows us to afford to be able to do this. We have t-shirts now, by the way. Check out our store. If nothing else, please subscribe to both our channels and share our videos. That's an important thing you can do for us as well. Thank you for watching.